Now that it is sufficiently autumn, it is time to make myself that 18th century chemise à la Reine summer dress that I've been meaning to do all summer. For more on the design and history of this, I will link the concept design video above and below as you prefer. Once again, this video is the final in this little series sponsored by ye old Squarespace, but more, as we say, anon. I've decided to start by draping an underlayer for this dress, which will be made of a more solid cotton than the virtually sheer cotton lawn that will make up the outer layer of the dress. Sheerness wouldn't necessarily have been an issue historically, since the dress would have been worn over all the usual stays and shift, but for more modern purposes the dress is basically going to have to be lined. I'm just draping a super basic bodice shape on the dress form, then tracing these shapes onto some pattern paper to test it out in mock-up form. I draped the bodice piece with one dart on each side, but for the actual mock-up I ended up not stitching up the darts. You'll see in a bit, the closure situation is a bit of a puzzle on this, since the outer dress closes at center front with drawstrings, and I didn't want there to be an open space at the front, so I hoped the lining would remain continuous underneath the lawn overlay. Which means I wanted the underbodice to be loose enough that it could slip on over my head, then tighten up to fit when the drawstrings are pulled. At least that's my working hypothesis for now, but we shall see how this actually works in 3 dimensions. Also, please behold the fruits of a recent late-night Amazon impulse purchase, this noble dagger, pair of scissors, to feast thine eyes upon in utmost wonder. They are admittedly not meant to be fabric scissors, but you know what? They work, and one does not simply pass up this primary opportunity to be supremely extra, so haters can fasten yon britches and deal with it. Yes, I have put a link to this down below if you are likewise aesthetic trash and require these with a similar vengeance. Anyway. Once my pieces are all traced, they are then cut out, with normal paper shears of course because we are not heathens. Off camera, I tested the pieces on a mock-up, which was uneventful since it's now to be a loose-fitting bodice that required no fitting, except for the slight move of a shoulder strap position. So I'm now going to start cutting out the underbodice pieces from some medium weight white cotton, which has been pre-washed and pressed to prepare for making up. The overdress portion will be made from this white cotton lawn, which as you can see is much sheerer than the lining cotton that I'm cutting from most immediately. Unsheathing our noble shears again, no, I will not get over myself, the lining pieces are cut out. 1 front and back piece, each cut on the fold, and 2 front shoulder strap pieces in homage to 18th century dress patterning. These pieces are then pinned together, and before I take them to the machine, I'm first just going to get my skirt pieces together. I didn't make a pattern for this, just folded my fabric lengthwise and, using the bottom edge of my front and back underbodice pieces, measured that as the waist edge. Then it's 40 inches down from waist to floor for me, and I swung the hem out about 18 inches, since I think I want the finished hem to measure around 2 yards. This super simple trapezoidal piece is not the most highly engineered underskirt shape, and indeed I'm a bit nervous about having those 2 side seams on the bias, but this is how shifts of the 18th century would have been cut. 2 simple front and back pieces with either gores in the side seams or the side seams flaring out, as I've done here. My hope is that this underdress layer will vaguely echo the shift that would have been worn underneath the original chemise à la Reine for opacity. I'm going to sew the skirt together with French seams, so I'm pinning the 2 panels together with wrong sides facing. Then I'm taking all of my pinned pieces over to the electric sewing machine and stitching it all together, the side seams and straps of the underbodice as well as the skirt side seams. I decided not to French seam the bodice bit, since that'll sit closely to the overlayer of the dress and I'll just turn the wrong sides out so that the overlayer covers the raw edges and the finished seams face inside. Since the skirt is much looser and movable, I decided to finish those off. This may or may not have been the universe's manner of foreshadowing. Once that's done, I'm just quickly trimming down the seam allowance of the skirt to about 1/4 inch, then pressing open the seam allowance on both the skirt and the bodice. Then it's back to the machine to stitch the skirt seams again and finish off those edges. And more pressing. And more stitching, but this time I'm stitching the skirt bit to the bodice bit at the waist, so at least we have a complete, very boring looking white cotton dress. As I have both side seams now on the bias, I'm going to hang this underdress up for a few days so that it has a chance to stretch a bit before I hem it. Meanwhile, I'm going to get on with the overdress, which will be made from this much lighter, sheer cotton lawn. As the whole thing is very densely gathered, it will need to initially be very, very wide. I'm going to create this by seaming 4 lengths of my 45-inch wide cotton together at the selvages, which means cutting 4 lengths of material the measurement from my shoulder to the floor. For me, 60 inches. If you recall from part 1, the design portion of this series, I purchased 10 yards of this cotton, and this turned out to be way more than enough. My lengths are just under 2 yards each, which means I probably could have gotten away with 8 yards, but you may require more if you are taller, or less if your fabric is a wider 55 or 60-inch width and you only need 3 panels instead of 4. Whilst measuring, I only clipped a small marking after each 60-inch point. To cut the panels fully, I'm first drawing out a single thread at each clipped point. This gap in the weave of the material will give me a clear, perfectly straight line to cut along and ensure that my panels are perfectly straight on grain. I can then pin my 4 panels together lengthwise or selvage ways, and since my fabric happens to have a really nice selvage that is narrow and clean at the edges, not wide and fluffy like most modern fabrics nowadays, I actually have to do no seam finishing on this outer layer. The panels can just be stitched together straight down and I'm done. Okay, here is the situation so far. Well, this is the underdress. This has been hanging up for a couple of days to allow the hem, the bias edges of the hem to stretch. As you can see, this was quite a wise decision because the bias seams have stretched quite a bit. So that's all well and good. That will just get chopped off and evened up, and then the hem will be even. So I'm having the current present dilemma now where the underdress that I made here, I was reluctant to put closures in it because I don't want to have a separate closure for this with a separate closure for the overdress, but the overdress has to close with drawstrings at the center front because that's how the gathering happens here and here. If there's not something solid underneath here, there's going to be a gap where the closure is because where the drawstring comes apart, because I won't be wearing stays and a chemise under this. My intent was to not have this have a closure and to make the bodice big enough that I could just slip it on over my head and then tie up the overdress across the front. In theory, that works. This does work on me. I can get this over my head. I cannot, however, get this over the head of the mannequin without putting in a closure. I don't want to make the bodice much bigger because then it's going to have too much excess fabric bunched up on me, but also I don't really want to put a closure in the underdress. But also, I have to be able to get this onto the mannequin because I have to essentially drape where I want the overdress to sit, like neckline-wise, in conjunction with the neckline of this dress. I cannot do it on myself because that is more annoyance than I'm willing to tolerate right now. So what I think I have decided to do is I think I'm going to rip the bodice off of this dress and only have the underskirt underlayer for the overdress. I mean, I wear camisoles under everything ever anyway. I would be wearing a camisole under this underdress as well, so why don't I just wear a white camisole underneath the dress and problem solved? That way this whole thing can just be slipped on, tied at the front. There will be no gap of skin down the center front because I will be wearing a white camisole, and all will be well, I think, presumably, right? So yeah, I think that's what I'm going to go ahead and give a try right now. So I did indeed go ahead and just separate the bodice and skirt pieces on that underdress, then took a quick shoulder seam to underbust and shoulder seam to waist measurement. This is going to tell me how far down to place my drawstrings, one of which will sit at the underbust and the other at the waist. For the drawstring casings, I'm just using this plain 1/4-inch cotton tape, pinning one strip all the way around the length of my now circularly sewn dress panels. The first strip here is placed 12 3/4 inches from the top edge of the fabric, or the measure from my shoulder to underbust. Once again, I'm trying to keep this as straight as possible, pinning my tape along the single straight grain line on the fabric. When I reach the point that I have decided will be my center front seam, which yes, should not have been sewn up and will be split later, I just clip the tape to about 1/2 inch beyond the seam, then fold the excess under to create a clean edge. The drawstring at the waist for me is measured an additional 4 inches below the underbust. So I'm now just placing the second strip of tape at this measure, once again following a straight grain line on the fabric. I'm then just carefully sewing down one edge of the tape, and while stitching down the bottom edge of the tape, inserting another length of the same cotton tape folded in half to act as the drawstring. Since my casings here are quite narrow and I didn't have a safety pin small enough to thread the tape through after the stitching. Also, I really didn't fancy threading a drawstring through circa 3 yards of fabric twice. This was incredibly tedious. Had I caught the drawstring tape at any point in the stitching, I'd have had to unpick and restitch that point, or else the drawstring would be caught and wouldn't gather. Thankfully, my hand stitcher's patience paid off here, and the solid 3 hours I spent stitching these tapes resulted in carefully inserted and perfectly functioning drawstrings on the first go. So now to make this wafty, diaphanous tube of fabric into a real actual dress. Having split the center front seam down to just below the waist tape casing, I then pinned it to my dress form with each of the 4 seams placed at the center front and back and both side seams respectively. These 4 seam lines will give me good marker points to make sure that I'm keeping the gathering even on all panels when I draw up the tapes. Once the waist and underbust tapes are drawn up properly, I'm then just controlling the top portion of the gathers, which will be finished off differently anon, by pulling the gathering up taut and pinning the fabric in place on the mannequin. I'll worry about the neckline shape in a bit. And by in a bit, I mean that working out the neckline is actually terrifying me completely, so I'm going to procrastinate that for a week and make the sash meanwhile. I'll be making said sash out of this bit of red silk satin, which I'm going to be using the matte, non-shiny side for a bit more of a casual look. I'm marking a 6-inch strip to make a 2.5-inch turned out strip with 1/2 inch of seam allowance on either side. I'm then just folding this strip in half with the shiny side facing out and pinning it all along the edge. I then cut the ends into these little diagonal shapes, but this turned out to be incorrect, and I fix it momentarily, so don't try this at home. The sash is then stitched along that raw edge, and at this point I realized I wanted to iron it so that the seam was in the middle of the underside of the sash instead of at the edge, which means that that angle of my diagonal edge was nonsensical and I cut them straight again. I then pressed this seam flat, then turned the strip so that the raw seam and the shiny satin side are now safely hidden away. The sash is then pressed nice and smoothly from the right side, and now I can recut those ends into proper diagonal angles, which are then turned in to hide the raw edges. These ends are just quickly slip-stitched closed by hand, catching only the inside seam allowances so that the stitches aren't seen from the outside. Okay, now I shall endeavor to get over myself and actually finish this dress, which involves figuring out the neckline so that I can get it off the dress form. I've tested out the shapes already by marking it quickly with pins, so now I'm just going through and basting the pleats down across the front and back neck edges, under the arm size, and across the lengths where the shoulder straps will go. Once everything is secure, I can unpin all the drapey stuff and remove the dress from the form. I'm then just trimming away all the excess fabric above the neckline and at the back neck and arm's eye, but leaving about 1/2 inch of excess for finishing. The front edge will be finished a bit differently though, since that one will get a drawstring across the top edge. Before I proceed further, I'm going to need some shoulder strap bits to connect the front and back pieces, which I'm now just harvesting from my discarded underbodice thing. These are 2 inches wide, and however long you need to connect the back shoulder to the front bodice bit, which for me was 5.5 inches. I'm deliberately cutting these from the opaque cotton, as this will be sturdier than the lawn, and the shoulder straps will need to take a bit of strain. Now I'm just going to put a drawstring into the top edge of the bodice front. I've just marked with pins where that basting line was, then removed the basting so that the gathering comes undone. Then, since I decided that my current neckline position was a bit too low, I'm just putting in a new basting line on the flat fabric at 1/2 inch above that initial basting line at the pin marks. Then, after trimming the excess material at 1/2 inch above that, I can fold the raw edge to the basting line, then fold the basting line to form a drawstring casing. Once again, I'm attempting to insert the drawstring in a single go here, trapping the cotton tape in the fold as I pin. The casing is then stitched at the very edge, taking care not to trap the actual drawstring. And when I get to the end of the channel at the shoulder strap, I'm just taking a couple of stitches diagonally across the channel to trap that end of the tape so that it has an anchor point to function as a drawstring. Next, I guess it's time for sleeves. I'm determined for these not to be stupidly difficult, so we're going to keep this as simple as possible. I'm tracing the sleeve head off of another sleeve pattern because I can't be bothered with drafting right now. These are then cut on the bias out of the cotton lawn with disappointingly normal shears since Cesario was napping on my feet and thus I was forced to use what was in reach. The bottom edges are then hemmed by hand with a small felling stitch. Then, before I can start sewing in sleeves and finishing off edges, I'm first just going to bind off the raw edges of the shoulder strap seams with some of the cotton tape, folded in half over the seam allowance and stitched into place. This way, these seams are finished before getting stitched into the outer binding, as you shall see presently. But first, I'm just going to stitch the sleeves into sleeves and finish off the circa 2-inch seam with a bit of felling. And the sleeves are attached uneventfully, which is always a wondrous occasion. Then I can get to finishing off all of these edges, which will be done similarly to the shoulder strap seam by binding off the edges with a bit of cotton tape. I'm just pinning this about 1/16 of an inch in from the stitching line on both arm's eyes, as well as the back, neck, and shoulder strap edges. This is then stitched down right at the edge of the tape. The excess seam allowance is then trimmed away right to the edge of the tape, and the tape is folded to the inside of the dress and felled into place. And whilst I am in felling mode, I am also taking a moment to hem the top waist edge of the underskirt layer. Are there faster, modern ways to do this? Probably yes. Is this the point in a machine sewn project where I cease to care and feel the uncontrollable need to hand sew everything ever for the duration of eternity? Also yes. Now, since the underskirt is loose enough to slide on without a closure, but still much smaller than the length of the material gathered at the waist, I'm just going to lightly tack the waist of the underskirt to the overskirt at the front, back, and both sides. This will keep it into position and allow the excess room to be gathered up when I pull the drawstrings on the overdress, but won't add as much bulk under the full 180 inches of gathering on the lighter overdress. Finally, I'm just putting some little tiny hems on the overdress and underdress layers by hand, which, yes, I am slightly abbreviating here, but in reality took approximately 95 eternities, and the dress is complete. And now just to wait until summer. Hello, friends. You have made it to the end of this video. Welcome to the floor of what is now sort of almost finally my sewing space. More on that to come anon. And by anon, I mean probably a little while because I have a lot of footage for this. Yes, there will be a vlog. Yes, there will be a tour for whatever that's worth because I hear people are interested in that kind of thing. Anyway, congratulations on making it to the end of this video wherein you shall be feebly rewarded with updates. You also get floof content because you're here. Okay, well, I shall have to do the remainder of this video from a very awkward angle because the guinea pig content is clearly very important. Hi. Oh my god, you are such a distraction. So I must first take a moment to thank our sponsor for this video. That is the Squarespace. Squarespace is the online web development website building platform that has inspired me to finally get around to setting up my own website. I am super pleased with how clean and professional the designs look because if you know my graphic design skills, you know they are absolute garbage. I have also decided to start publishing my upload schedule / return dates right on the homepage of the website. So when you go to the homepage of the website, the first thing that you will see is the date of my next upload. So when I'm running weekly, it will just say Saturday. However, when I take a weekly hiatus or if I take a little break, like I'm going to do this week, you will see the date of my impending return right there on the website if you forget it. Okay, so I literally go on for like 15 minutes. If you would like to join me on these website endeavors that I'm clearly very enthusiastic about, do go to squarespace.com to start your free trial, and when you are ready to launch your website, go to squarespace.com/Bernadette banner for 10% off that first purchase. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you learned how to make a dress, maybe. I hope maybe you also learned how not to make a dress. In other news, this dress is really comfy and I kind of don't really want to take it off. I'm going to be wearing it lots probably, although it is now autumn, although it is like October next week and it's still like 30 degrees outside Celsius. Because I don't know Fahrenheit. It's hot, so maybe I will actually get some wear out of this, which I'm really excited about. Meanwhile, I have other sewing projects to get started on, which probably won't be seen around here for a little while still, but I have a sewing room to go up. I have a couple of more research-based things in the works. I actually have so many video ideas that I have enough content to upload weekly through the second week of January. However, none of it's filmed, none of it's scripted, none of it's planned, so I'm hoping taking a week to sort of film some stuff, prep some footage, will put me on track to start uploading lots of content. I've got some exciting things, I hope, and I hope you will stick around and join me on these adventures, because I enjoy adventures. Anyway, I shall not, in fact, see you anon this time, friends. I shall see you in a fortnight's time, and I shall miss you most dearly until then. But until then, until. What? Oh my god, why are you such a croissant? Where are you going?